Um, Hopefully everyone can see that. I'm just gonna assume that you can, and if you can't, just unmute yourself and let me know. Um, so thank you to Joan and Jen and all of the people at the art department at GCC, and for all of you for coming. I'm excited to share my work with you, and I will be going through some slides and starting from, the early part of my journey as an artist and going all the way up to now, present day. And I also wanted to leave a couple of minutes before questions and answers to give you a little brief tour of my studio because that's where I am right now, is in my studio. So this first slide is a painting that I did in high school. So I started out really loving to paint and draw as a kid and into high school. And even though I did a lot of other things and was good at a lot of other things, painting and drawing and art is really what stuck with me. And I decided to pursue an art degree at Rutgers University at the Mason Gross School of the Arts. And so that was kind of the beginning of, really making a commitment and taking art seriously. And I learned so much in my undergrad experience. So as a high schooler, to me, art making was about painting and drawing. And then when I got to art school, it was like, whoa, there's this whole other world of, thinking about art conceptually. And there was a strong focus in, looking at contemporary artists. And this image that we're looking at right now was actually my thesis work that I did in undergrad. I managed to dig up this image somewhere because most of the images from my undergrad are, I don't know where they are, but this was actually a performance that I did. I was really inspired by a lot of the contemporary artists that I was looking at the time that were, making work about their personal and their cultural identity. And so I wanted to kind of follow suit with a lot of um, that lineage. And so this was my first and probably last foray into performance, but it's just interesting to frame my work in this way because I very much identify as a painter, and you'll see that just from this image alone that I kind of started with painting and then took a detour into performance and video and everything else that I can do that wasn't painting, and then I came back to painting. So um, this is actually not my work. This is just, I wanted to show some of the artists that I was looking at the time. So this is the work of Mona Hatoum, who is a Palestinian British artist. And she makes work, along the same lines of dealing with her cultural and personal identity. Um, in her work, she's dealing a lot with uh, thinking about distance and space, um, politically and physically, and how that, impacts her personal life, and, even thinking about the body as being part of that conversation. So these were etchings of hair, and I was making a lot of work about hair at the time too. And this is another one of her works. And interestingly enough, at my time at Rutgers, they have or they had a printmaking department that used to invite artists and make editions for them. So Mona Hatoum was one of the artists, and she had this edition of this piece made there while I was there. And that was very influential to me to be able to get exposed to, a lot of the contemporary artists of the time, and this is another one of her pieces. Um, and shortly after my undergrad, I got invited to be part of this show that happened at Rutgers, and it was featuring Renee Cox and a lot of other female artists who have now since blown up. And the person who curated the show was Latoya Ruby Frazier. And so that was also influential to me again to, you know, get exposure to working with alongside other professional artists and people who are much further along in their career. So all of these experiences really helped, shape my trajectory and shape my thinking around the kind of work that I wanted to make. And this is just an image of me at a gallery in Chelsea. This exhibition is the work of Donald Odilio Dita. And here are some of the other artists that I was looking at was Mark Tansey and James Rosenquist. They were all influential on me, and Mark Bradford. I worked at the Studio Museum in Harlem after graduating from undergrad, and so I got exposed to even more work. And then I ended up working for Chitra Ganesh, and this is her piece here. And so all of this is to kind of show you some of the people that were influencing my work at the time. And so this is my work. And I made this piece in graduate school. I think this was maybe one of the first paintings that I made when I got to graduate school. And so coming from, having this love for painting and drawing, and then going to a school where there was a lot of emphasis on conceptual, and I was trying to figure out what my voice was in art making. This was kind of like I was bringing painting back into my language, and this was my way of, uh, you know, trying to bring everything together that I learned. And so this is a self portrait, and I have the patterns kind of obscuring my face. And I was thinking a lot about, these concepts of masking or disguising, and also the meanings behind these patterns. The patterns that are in these pieces, you'll see that these kind of repeating patterns were taken from videos that I took of my grandmother that I turned into uh, a project. Um, and so I was just trying to make sense of all these different ways of working and bringing them into together, and thinking a lot about, you know, the the themes and the connecting threads. Here's a drawing that I made, just an observational drawing. And then this is an image of me getting married because, you can't talk about art without talking about, things that happen to you in your life, because all those things impact my art making. And so a lot of you may recognize Andre. He gave an artist talk last month as part of this series. And so being married to someone who's an artist is, of course, also influential on the way that I think and work. And Andre is also a painter. And this is, I think, was taken at the Armory, and this was Paula Rigo. This is Paula Rigo's work. And so I started at this time in graduate school, I was starting to paint again, and I was starting to bring figuration into my work. So, this is another painting that I made where I was trying to think about portraying myself and like my perspective on myself, and trying to experiment with all the different ways of mark making and painting, and also dabbling in collage and mixed media. So you'll see there's this kind of running theme of fabric masking the face. It's kind of interesting to think about that now in this time that we're living in. But yeah, those were some of the ideas that I was interested in, and I was trying to figure out different ways to portray those ideas. And here's another collage piece where it's reductive, so the patterns that are masking the face were kind of pasted behind the paper and then it was cut out. And this drawing, looking back at this drawing, which I made probably in 2012, so that's now almost 10 years ago. Wow. Um, these kind of devices of breaking up the picture plane and juxtaposing, disparate looking images together to kind of create a new whole. This is something that's coming back into the work that I'm doing now. So I made this drawing just, observationally, looking at um, a piece of clothing that was nailed to the wall and a chair, and sort of figured out a way to kind of uh, meld them together. And I was also at the time, trying to self-organize myself with other artists to show my work. So this was an exhibition that I did with a few other artists at the University of Maine. This was also during graduate school. So this is a picture of me and the other artists that organized this show together. And I am including this to say that, a lot of the experiences that I got were just me really trying to go out there and forge them for myself. So, like in the beginning of my career, it was a lot of just trying to make your own space in a way. And so this was one of those shows. And this is a studio visit I did with an artist in India. She's actually a family friend. And so, I also, everywhere I went, I tried to meet other artists and tried to understand how they did what they did. And I think that when you're early on in your career, doing all those types of things can really help understand what your trajectory can be. And so this is an image from my thesis work in graduate school. Um, I was still, interested in figuration at this point, and this piece is called Three Women of Maria Theresa. So some of you may recognize that there's a pretty direct reference to the Velázquez painting of Maria Theresa. And that's the center image of the on the face is a direct reference to that. And then I was kind of interested in riffing off of that idea of, you know, referencing art history, and then also trying to think about myself or women that I knew and trying to insert that story into an art historical canon, and still playing around with painting and thinking about collage. So none of this is actually collage in a mixed media sense, but I wanted it to look like a fragmented collage, but just be all painted. So it's kind of more of an illusion of a collage. And this was another piece that I did for my thesis show in graduate school. Um, again, it was like figuration, but I was trying to also find different ways to look at images and just do something to them to make it feel off. And in doing that, that somehow um, gets you to read the image in a different way. And so this painting is actually really big. It's uh, 8 feet wide and I think 5 feet tall. So it took up, an entire wall in the gallery. And um, it was just, so I don't know if you can tell because whenever I ask people if they can tell what is in this image, I get very different answers. But um, it's actually a line of pageant girls that are on stage awaiting to, get their trophies. And I was captivated by these images of these little pageant girls, they're young pageant girls, and thinking about making them anonymous, removing their identity, their faces, and then stretching the image in a way that kind of made it like it when you from doing that you're not sure whether they're children or they're adults or what you're looking at because it kind of messes with the proportions. So um I was making a lot of work with with that imagery. And I was kind of interested, so I kind of made the shift from making work about myself or using my likeness in the work, and then trying to think about things outside of myself, if that makes sense. So I was trying to look at images of other people rather than images of myself, because I was becoming less and less interested in just portraying myself. I felt like there was more that I could say if I looked outside of myself. Some of you may recognize this person, Tyler Buros. So I did a brief stint of curating after graduate school, where I helped to start this gallery in Rhode Island and curated a few exhibitions. So along with the art making, there were other means that I was interested in too around exhibitions, like for instance curating. And um, so that was also informative to me, and the work that I was making was just having these opportunities to look at other artists, discover other artists, and also the logistics of what it takes to organize an exhibition. And all of the kind of professional things that go along with organizing an exhibition. And so after I was done with graduate school, I was in this place where all of a sudden it's like, well, no one really cares if I'm painting or not. I mean, it sounds like an exaggeration to say that, but when you're in school, you have the faculty and you have the community and you have the people that are kind of encouraging you to make work, and you have opportunities to share your work, and you feel like there's this momentum that you can kind of go off of. But then once you're out of school and you're completely by yourself, it's like you can quit or you can keep going. And I found that to be so liberating because when you're in school, you're constantly having to justify the work that you're making, and you have to sound really intelligent about the work that you're making, and it has to you're being held accountable. But then when you leave school and it's completely up to you whether or not you continue pursuing it or not, some people get thrown off by that and stop altogether. But for me it was like very liberating, like I can literally do anything I want. And nobody has to see it. I can just decide not to share it and nobody has to see it. So I decided to use this time after graduate school to really intensely focus on figuring out how I want to paint and um, learning how to paint in a way, because I had to sort of teach myself like all of the technical aspects of painting that I wanted to learn. So I was focusing on painting these balloons. I became really interested in these balloons. Just it started out like for technical reasons. Like I thought, okay, maybe this is like a difficult thing to paint, and I want to see if I can try to capture it. But then they sort of transformed into these, kind of symbolic, like very iconic um, images. And then I found that kind of fascinating, because it's like once I started paring down to just one object, then it really became about like how am I going to convey a certain mood or a certain type of meaning or a certain sense of feeling through just portraying this one object. And it became sort of a challenge for myself. And also, they're kind of funny and fun in a way, and whimsical. But some people look at these images and think that they're really dark. So it's very interesting, that dichotomy. I think that that dichotomy of the kind of pleasurable but also maybe dark is something that shows up in my work even now. So again, I started focusing a lot on just figuring out how to paint, and even just really technical things like which colors do I want to use in my palette and why, and having a reason for all the choices that I make, instead of just doing them arbitrarily, or instead of just doing them because someone that taught me how to do it did it this way. I wanted to have my own reason for um, these decisions that I make in the studio. And this painting was interesting because I didn't actually intend for these images to be um, juxtaposed next to each other. I was just doing it to save paper, really. But then after I was done, I was, very fascinated by these two images which seemingly have nothing to do with each other being forced into one picture plane, and how when that happens, there's a conversation that's forced between the two. Um, and that then one can maybe extract meaning out of that. So with this, there wasn't an intention with putting them together, but I liked the happy accident that came out of seeing them together. And I think that that continues to make its way through in my work even now. Um, so these pieces that I'm showing you now are 11 by 14. So they're much smaller than what I was doing in graduate school. In grad school, I had the space to work really big. And at this time, I was working in my bedroom studio, so I didn't have a lot of space. So that also changed the way that I work. Um, and I bring this picture up just to show in the chronology that that at this time I got pregnant with my first kid. Um, and being a mom definitely changed the way that I was not only making work in terms of time and physically, but it also changed conceptually a lot of things of how I thought about my work too. Um, and at this time, Andre and I also started collaborating on some public art projects where we worked with young people and creating murals. I think this was one of the first projects that we worked on together. I don't know if you can see in the picture, but I was pregnant at the time, so it was like even with being pregnant and having kids, like the art thing just kept moving. Like I just tried to keep up the momentum, and even though some days were very hard, like I was just trying to get the momentum. Just as long as it's still moving, that's all that matters, you know. Um, and this was a mural that we did in Springfield, part of the Fresh Paint Mural Festival, which happened in 2019. Um, so you can see in this mural the same pageant girl uh, pageant girl subject matter was made its way into our mural too, but this time they have faces, slightly different. There is a picture of us on the lift. So it's a really tall building. It was a first for both of us and challenging because I was deathly afraid of heights and had to conquer my fears doing this mural. But I think all of these types of projects that take you outside of the studio are really good. And it doesn't mean that I don't want to be in the studio, because I still want to come back to the studio and work on my paintings that I have, you know, my individual things. But um, doing these types of projects definitely also helps me conceive of the work that I wanted to do. And here is a picture of my studio, the same studio that I'm in right now. And this is like the first, what feels like a, I don't know if I should say real studio, but because I've had studios in bedrooms before this, but it was like the first non-bedroom studio space that I had that wasn't in school. So just we outfitted the basement with lights and a couple of walls, and this is where I'm working now. And those paintings that you see in this image, they don't exist anymore. I think I've painted over them. I think I've painted over that one painting like 5 times already. So that's something that I that I don't have any qualms about doing, is just painting over old work. Um, but now I'm trying to not do that and start afresh so I can just, you know, save them as I go along. And so here I'm still working on, you know, the same, figuring out how I want to paint. And so these, I called them quick studies because I wanted to have some kind of practice that I was doing that I could do quickly. And there was a practical reason for that because, you know, having a baby, I didn't have a lot of time to get into the studio. So I needed to find a way to keep painting, but something that didn't take a lot of time and something that, you know, I could finish quickly and feel like I was making some progress and moving forward. Again, keeping that ball rolling, the momentum going. So I did these quick studies, and, you know, I did them from life, and they were just, you know, things around my studio. But what you don't necessarily see in these works is that I was figuring out things, like I was trying to pare down my palette and figure out how to use a limited palette. So I was trying to figure out how to just do things with maybe like 3 colors, and how do I, you know, focus on the things that I want to focus on, but changing these few things. And so there was constant experimentation going on, um, even though it may not necessarily seem like that from these images. But every time I made a new work, I was trying to experiment with something new, um, and trying to build up my language for painting. Yeah, so these are some more of that. So by this point, I was starting to figure out, you know, how I wanted to paint, you know, from the way that I'm applying paint to the color choices that I was making. And also starting to realize that a lot could be said in these kind of minimal, like with the least amount of, brush strokes, and what's the least amount of colors that I can use to really push the envelope. So I was kind of interested in that. Some people call it like the painting economy, like the way that you can kind of um, portray an idea with the least amount of things available to you. So I was pushing that, and I was doing a lot of these color charts to study color, and like the kind of things that you have to do in art school, that when you're in art school you're like, ah, I don't want to do it. Yeah, I was doing it for fun, just for myself, because I that's just how my brain works. Like when I outside of painting, I want to be able to get super calculated so that by the time I am actually working on a painting, my brain doesn't have to be in that very calculated mode, if that makes sense. So like I want to study all those super technical and calculated things outside of my painting practice, and then when I get to the painting I can just kind of have them move to the subconscious so that I can just play a little bit more. Um, and so then I started going back to the pageant girls. In a way, I was going back to them because I had spent a lot of time studying all of these technical things, and to me, the way that I could mark my progress was to go back to these recurring things and, making applying the changes that I've learned. And as I was making these paintings, I was like, why am I making paintings about pageant girls? And then I started making paintings about these cowboys without heads. Why am I making these paintings? And I think to me that they were conceptually they were trying to talk about, something about Americana, because they're in these images. To me, the connecting thing was that they are getting to some kind of like aspect of Americana that maybe of an era that doesn't exist anymore, but it does still exist in this kind of weird way. So I when I'm making my work, I don't think ahead of time what the work is about and try to plan it out. Some people work in that way, but for me, if I worked in that way, I feel like it just becomes it maybe would become too didactic, and it would become too calculated and too slick, and I want there to be room for the unknown, and I want there to be room for the mysterious and the intrigue while I'm working, because that's what motivates me to make the work, is the kind of discovery along the way. So if I plan everything out ahead of time, then it's not fun for me. So a lot of times I go back and I start connecting the dots. Like, why did I do this? And how are these paintings all connecting? And um, so, you know, I looked back at these paintings and I realized, like, oh yeah, that's kind of interesting. They're all sort of, children in these fantasy like things, and it's kind of dealing with Americana. And so once I started connecting those dots, I was like, oh yeah, so maybe it's more profound than I thought when I was making it. But sometimes those things can happen unconsciously. Um, and like I said, I in my practice I want to allow that room for discovery and not knowing the answer all the time, because I think that if we know the answer all the time, then what's the point, That's not what keeps me going back to the studio. So here are, just more iterations in this series. And these paintings are what I call small. This one was 18 by 24. So for me, that's, relatively small. And as I was continuing to work, I started becoming interested in this idea of luminosity. It's something I'm still exploring in my work. So that's another thing that I don't have all the answers to right now, but I'm sort of working through it right now. And it kind of feels like that classic, the classic endeavor for any painter, any photographer is like, oh, how do you capture light in something that's not luminous? So there's that very, classic exercise, but then it's also affected by, the fact that we're always in front of an illuminated device right now with our screen. So it's like, how do we think about, um, like, can a painting feel illuminated if our eyes are so used to seeing a screen that's illuminated, or nowadays most of the way that we even see a painting is through the screen. So how what is the relationship between the screen and the surface of the canvas and paint? um, and it's interesting to use oil paint to think about those things, because oil paint was invented initially for its luminosity, and so now, how does that luminosity compare to these devices that we have? So these are things that I'm thinking about when I'm making these works. This is a painting that's called Stalemate, and the painting actually came to me through a dream. um, I had this very strange dream, and uh, in a nutshell, I was thinking about this idea of being at an impasse. And at this point I was trying to think about my work less literally. So even though I'm using representational images in my work, I don't necessarily want it to be a one-to-one read. So even though this is a painting of a ship exploding, to me it was like I was trying to explore the different ways that I can represent things that are felt but not seen visually. So there's another paradox right there, is like, how do you represent something visually that's not seen? um, and it is funny to use representationalism to do that, because you would think that abstraction would get you there more easily, but this is what I'm trying to figure out for myself, is how to use representation in that way. And here's a painting that's called Tether. This painting is 7 feet wide. So at this time, I started to incorporate larger scale painting back into my practice. And um, again, I'm thinking a lot about like the things that are unseen. So this painting is called Tether, and for me, it was kind of a funny joke, because visually I wanted there to be this line that connected from one image to the next, but that connection happened outside of the picture plane. And so that's why the name Tether came to me, was because I was thinking about um, a tether, maybe an unseen tether between two physical things. So, like a connecting thread. And so in this painting, there's a light that's connected to a body, and I also was thinking a lot about, a lot of metaphysical things. Like at this time, like being a mom, like I really started to think about life and death conceptually, and just all the unanswered questions that we have, and like trying to figure it out in painting, and trying to use painting as a way to understand and confront these ideas. So this was that for me, as it is still in my work that I'm making now. And so, yeah, again, like going back to that uh, drawing that I did of the chair and the dress that was nailed to the wall, I wanted to bring back this idea of breaking up the picture plane, like having multiple paintings in one painting, so to speak. Um, and in this one, it's is another very long painting. I was thinking about almost like um, a film negative and having, multiple frames like in this long strip, and thinking about time and like how we in the West like read from left to right and think about time in a kind of linear way and a narrative way, and then having these moments. So it's the same image, but then the image changes and it gets disrupted. And, you know, in that, there's a lot to be said about how time changes. And so these were a lot of the ideas that I was exploring, I'm still exploring. Um, and so this is uh, the beginning of working on these series of painting these flowers that um, are in my dining room, or were in my dining room. This is a painting of the flowers as they were dying. Um, and I was actually talking to Joan about this yesterday, but um, yeah. So the idea behind these paintings was they started out that I was observing these flowers that were in my dining room and just like thinking about how the light changed. Um, there was this blue light that came into the window. It was winter time, so around 4 or 5 o'clock, this blue light would come into through the window. Everything outside would look so blue, and I was trying to understand, this idea of the light changing. It's changing color. I mean, I'm a painter, so I'm always thinking about like the color of light and like observing that. But how that color of the light would change throughout the year with the seasons, but also throughout the day. And then there was this one thing that kind of just stayed there every day, which was the that windowsill and those flowers. But then the flowers were also changing because they're slowly dying, but um, they have a different timeline than the light. And like watching all these things kind of interact with each other on a daily basis, and that repetition. So I just became very interested in that and wanting to play with those ideas. So I first started by just painting the flowers and thinking about the light and how the light was changing. And then I started bringing back these visual devices that I was playing with of breaking up the picture plane, because I wanted to see how I could push this idea of thinking about time and disrupting time through this visual way. And so this was my way of doing it, is seeing the difference between the blue light and like a normal, light bulb light, and the contrast between the two, and how, it slowly changes over time. So these were kind of studies in a way, because I was just, painting something that I was trying to figure out. So in a way, all my paintings end up being studies, but um yeah, I was trying to discover something in making them. And so this blue palette has become really important to me. And I started thinking about what the blue palette means to me. It was not just that type of light that was coming in through the window, but it was also the light from the screen, from the phone, from the computer. It's like that blue light is just so persistent in our daily life now. And I'm trying to understand it in all its different forms and all its different ways. Um, so I'm just gonna skip ahead to this one and go back to the one. So yeah, so in this one it was like on the left there's the blue light of the screen, and then on the right there's the blue light from the window. But then they're the same. They're the same blue light, but they're different because one you know, is man-made and one is not. And yet I'm trying to understand them like in the same space with the same palette. And this painting is called 634. So I had taken this image of my son from 3 years ago, and I noticed, the time that that image was taken, and I'd been wanting to make a painting of that image for a very long time, and I just never did. And when I finally did, I realized that it was the same time as, this other event of looking outside my window. And I was just thinking about how time repeated in that way, almost like this cycle, but but it was different at the same time. So I'm using all of these devices to talk about that. And so yeah, this blue palette is something, conceptually for me that has that resonance that I'm still trying to investigate and trying to figure out. This painting is actually in a show right now at the museum at UMass, the Contemporary Art Museum at UMass. And the show is up in person. It's going to be there through the fall now. They extended the show. So when they open the museum up to the general public, you can get a chance to see it in person. But it's part of a group exhibition called We Are for Freedoms, and the museum invited artists to think about what freedom meant to them. And so this was my response. Um, the I was thinking about the events around the country of monuments getting toppled, and I found that very fascinating because I was thinking about, these people that feel bound by the history of this country, and they're toppling monuments in protest. And I was also thinking about this phrase, like, if you don't know your history, you're doomed to repeat it. And to me, it's those two things were at odds with one another. And I was very fascinated by that, seeing it as a dilemma. And for me, my way of dealing with things is, trying to figure it out through painting. So I I took this image of one of the monuments that was toppled, which is of Andrew Jackson in Washington, D.C. And then I layered these fragments of this toy horse, which is actually taken from another painting that I did, and thinking about the idea of fantasy and idealism, and how those ideas of fantasy and idealism fueled not only the making of the monuments but also the destruction of these monuments too, and how the two things parallel each other in a weird way. Like, even though they're on opposite ends of the spectrum, they can mirror each other and parallel each other. And that mirroring and paralleling of, two opposite ends is a recurring theme that has come up in my work, and is what I'm currently working on right now. So, um, look familiar? These are the paintings that are behind me right now that are in progress. I'm working on them as we speak, and it's the same idea of mirroring. So I'm taking um, this imagery from protests, and I um, am obscuring them in a way where they start to. So they're taken from very different places. Okay, some of the protest images are taken from here in the U.S., and then the other ones are taken from India. As many of you have probably heard like some of the largest protests in human history that have ever happened are happening right now in India. So I was very interested by this idea of how these events that are happening on two opposite ends of the world can mirror each other and almost reflect each other. Um, and I'm using that same blue palette to talk about these things that I'm interested in conceptually, like time and mirroring and distance. So that's what I'm working on right now. And I would love to. Oh, wait, there's one more thing that I wanted to show you. So, what I have here is just for you to see how my paintings progress from start to finish. This is how they start. And oops, well, this is where they are right now. And let me just spin the laptop around so you can see my studio. I'm very, I want to be very transparent about the way I work because I think that's very useful. So those are some finished paintings. You've seen them in the presentation. And these are the paintings that I'm working on now that I showed you. And yep, there's a full spin of my studio. So yeah, I'm open to any questions that you might have about my journey or my work or my studio, anything practical or impractical. So shoot.
Okay, I teach painting at GCC, and I was really relating to when you were talking about trying to figure out how you want to paint, and by the way, you've been touching on so many things that we've been talking about in class, so that was really great. But you know, I've been painting for 30 years, and the opportunity in painting versus say drawing to me is bottomless. Like it's just there's so many decisions to make with painting that it's almost like you never really figure out how you want to paint. And so I could really relate to you when you were saying that you know, the work that you're doing is always like an investigation into something that you want to learn about, to get closer to that way that you want to paint. But then we're always changing, and so I'm learning that I don't think it's ever going to happen. And I think that my paintings are the result of that search. And even though I think I'm going to like settle in a little bit more as I get older into a certain way that I want to paint, or eliminate at least the ways that I don't want to paint, um, I think it's such a gradual, slow process that cannot be pushed and maybe never even found.
Yeah.
I don't know. I just really relate to that.
Yeah, and I wouldn't have it any other way, right? Because
Yeah.
it's like you would hope that it is a lifelong pursuit and
Mhm.
something that keeps you, as I said, coming back to the studio. You don't ever want to quit. So that sense of discovery, that sense of, inquiry, you really have to have it at that deep level. And in some ways it can seem unsatisfying when you're like, oh, am I ever really gonna get to that goal? The goalpost keeps moving. But um I've just learned to embrace it and lean into it over the years. And I think measuring your expectations in that way is what helps with
Yeah, and I do think though you can get closer, like you said, to why you're using the material you're using, why you're using the color you're using, why you're applying the paint the way you're doing it. Like those things, I think, hopefully get tighter in their relationship and truth.
yeah, yeah, definitely.
One thing I was wondering also is you're mentioning like how we are viewing all these paintings on screen, which never really does it justice. And I'm wondering how personally you feel like your paintings are translating. Um, Sometimes I think the more subtle the paintings are, the worse they look on the screen or they don't reflect at all. And sometimes I think paintings could look better if they're not that great, like in their subtleties. So I'm just wondering.
Yeah. It's a conundrum that we're in right now in this age that we're living in, because in some sense the biggest way that we can share our work right now is digitally, right? Like most people are never going to see your paintings in person. They're going to see them digitally. And so in one sense that's great because you have a wider audience that you can share with, and but in another sense I'm still a purist in that way where it's like I want experiencing the painting in person to be the ultimate experience, and I want that to be better than seeing it on the screen. Um, I want there to be things that you see in person that you don't get from seeing on the screen. So it's like you're rewarded with that physical confrontation of the work rather than just seeing it on the screen. And also, you're not seeing it at the same scale, you're not seeing the surface. So all of those things matter to me, and I think they matter to a lot of painters and a lot of artists. But in another sense, you do have to make your work um, still look captivating on the screen, because that's what entices people to know about you and to want to know more about your work and to go see it in person, right? So it's that invitation is still it's still digital.
One of the topics that's been coming up over and over again with them is the selfishness that they feel of choosing an art path. And I know that's an issue that comes up a lot as a mom when you make the decision to go to your studio over hanging out with your kid.
Yeah, it's difficult. It's definitely difficult. But I also think that those negotiations happen no matter what. I mean, I feel like in some sense I was dealing with those negotiations even before I had kids. It's like how are you going to make time in the studio, because you have to prioritize it over other things that you want to do, and you can't do everything. You can't do everything in one day. And an art practice is one of those things where, at least I found for me, that if I can try to go in every day, even if I get like 2 minutes just to go into my studio and just look at my work for 2 minutes, that is something. And it's better than like getting 8 hours once a week. Because again, as I said in my talk about momentum, like building that momentum and not letting that momentum ever slide back, I think is more productive in a way and than getting that 8 hour painting session once a week or once a month. So I've learned to adjust my practice to accommodate that. It took me a while to figure that out, but just like the painting itself, it's always changing. So is my practice in terms of time and the amount of time I have in a day. I mean, that's going to continue to change for the rest of my life. So it's just accommodating that flexibility in your practice is something that has to stay with you, um, as long as you want to keep doing it. Life changes, and I try to see it the way that I'm trying to think about it now is not so much that life gets in the way, but the life that I'm living that's happening is the fodder for the work that I'm making. So I don't want it to not happen. I don't want it to not exist or to not interrupt, because I've learned to draw from that in order to make the work. So I think that, if you can get to that place in your life where you kind of reconcile that can change your perspective and the way you think about your life, that the two are integral and they go hand in hand.